Hello and welcome back everyone to yet another lesson in web development. In today's lesson, we are going to be discussing PHP data types, and much like JavaScript and many other programming languages, PHP also has its own built-in set of data types. Let's have a look at the objectives for today's lesson. So in today's lesson, we will be covering the following. First, we'll explore the various PHP data types available to us. We'll then move on to understanding how PHP constants are slightly different from data types. And then we'll have a PHP practical demonstration to wrap things up as always. Excellent. Now for our very first topic in today's lesson, exploring PHP data types. Now, what exactly are PHP data types? Well, if you think about it like this, variables can store data of different types. And different data types can perform different kinds of operations or do different things. We can use the var underscore dump function to actually evaluate and return the data type assigned to a specific variable. Now, when it comes to PHP data types, there are several data types available for use, but for the most part, these are the ones you'll be working with mostly. First, we have strings. We also have integers, floats, booleans. We have nulls, arrays, objects, and resources. Let's cover this in greater detail. Now, strings are fairly easy to understand, and they are pretty straightforward. A string is essentially a sequence of characters like hello world, or your name, or your surname, or an address. A string is basically just a bunch of characters put together, and they can include both numbers as well as letters. So here's an example of what a string looks like. What we are essentially doing here is we are just creating two variables, one called hello, which is variable X. We have variable Y, which is assigned a value of hello again. And then we essentially just echo this out with concatenation and a couple of break tags so we can get them on separate lines. We then use the var underscore dump function on the X variable to assess its data type. And you'll notice in our output at the bottom, we have this thing that says string 5 hello. So this indicates to us that this is actually a string with 5 characters, or that is the specific data type for this variable. Now, much like many other programming languages, we also have integers, and integers are essentially just numbers. More importantly, they are non-decimal numbers, but they can range between a negative value and a positive value. So let's have a look at an example. Over here, we've got two variables, int1 and int2, and they've been assigned numeric data. With regards to int2, you'll notice that we have a negative and positive number, which is exactly the same. So this would yield in 0. Now, if we call the echo var dump function and we pass in int1 as our parameter over here, we get this output that says int12345, which is an indication that this is a data type of int or integer. And the other statement, the two lines at the top that we are outputting, is essentially just the value of int1 and int2. We also have floats, and floats are a lot like integers. The only difference is that they have a decimal point assigned to them, okay? And this is something we cannot achieve with an integer. And here is an example of what a float looks like. When we call echo var dump on the two variables that we created, variable X has a decimal point, which is 10.365, and variable Y is an integer. How do we know this? Because it has an absolute value of 20 without decimal points. So when we echo this out, you'll see in the output that we have two different data types. The first one being a float and the second one being an integer. Booleans are actually very easy to understand. They will only ever represent two values or one of two values. That is, either a Boolean can be true or false, much like a switch of a light can be on or off. That's the easiest way to think about it. And here is an example of a Boolean statement in action. So we have a variable called X, which is set to true, and we have an if-else statement. If and else statements are things we'll cover at a later stage. We have an if statement that if X is equal to true, then echo out the first statement. This will always print. We also have an else statement, and in this else statement, this is the default condition if X is not equal to true. Now let's move on to arrays, and this one can be slightly tricky. An array is basically a data type that stores multiple values in one single variable. So you can think of this as a list that can store a ton of variables. There are two different kinds of arrays, and each value or each array value is accessed using an array index. Excellent. Now, when it comes to arrays, we have two different arrays that we can actually use. We have the numeric or indexed array, and we also have associative arrays. But what exactly is the difference between the two? Well, an indexed array is an array that uses numeric values to store data. Values are stored and accessed in a linear fashion. So we can assign values manually or automatically. Here is an example of an array in action. So what we have over here is this variable called cars, and then we assign it an array with three values: Volvo, BMW, and Toyota. And this is what the output looks like should we call this array with an echo function. At the 0th index, we have Volvo. At the first index, we have BMW. And at the second index, we have Toyota. Now, do keep in mind, when it comes to working with arrays, we always start an array from an index of 0 and not 1, because that's just how computers remember things in terms of storing data in a linear fashion. So what about associative arrays? Well, this is an array with strings as an index and not numeric values. This stores element values in association with key values rather than interacting or using strict linear index order. There are also two ways to create an associative array, and that is also manually or automatically. And here is an example of an associative array. Let's work through this. So over here, we've got three variables called salaries. Well, actually, they are just one variable if you think about it, because we are just working with an array. And here we are assigning manually. So for the Peter index, we have a value of 20,000. For the Ben index, we have a value of 37,000. And for the Joe index, we have a value of 43,000. So again, the idea here is instead of using 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on as index, we can actually use key pair values such as strings. So if we echo all of this out, we can actually see that for salaries at the Peter index, the string specifically, we get a value of 20,000. And with Ben, we have a value of 37,000 and so on. This is going to make a lot more sense once we actually have a practical demonstration. Next, we have the null data type. And this is a special data type that, unlike with booleans, can have only a single value, and that value is null. A variable of data type null is a variable that has no value assigned to it. If a variable is created without a value, it is automatically assigned a value of null. Variables can also be emptied by setting the value to null. And here we have an example of a null in action. At line 7, we've created a variable called x, and we set this equal to null. But before that, this variable actually had some sort of value, which was a string of hello world. We just decided to update it to null, and then we call the var underscore dump function on this so that we get the null output. Now, out of all of the data types so far, this might just be the trickiest one, an object. An object is a data type which stores data and information on how to process that data. In PHP, an object must be explicitly declared. First, we must declare a class of an object. For this, we use the class keyword. A class is a structure that can contain properties and methods. So here is an example of that. Now, one thing to note about objects is that the best way to think about objects is that this over here is the blueprint of an object. So we call the class keyword, then we create a class of car, which is this object, and then we have a function inside of this class. And we essentially just assign it a model and horsepower HP. This is the properties of the specific object. We can also assign things such as methods. And then we simply just call the object after we created it, or we create a new object, and then we can go to work with that object and call the properties on that object. So we can actually echo Herbie model, and we get a value of Porsche, and then we echo Herbie HP, which is horsepower, and we get a value of 250. Again, objects are going to make a lot more sense once we actually practice them. Now, resources is essentially the final data type on this list, and resources are special variables that hold references to resources external to PHP, such as a database connection. Now, once we've covered a bit of SQL and we understand how to perform CRUD operations, we will revisit the topic of resources to better understand how they are used to make connections to a database. Wonderful. Now let's move on to PHP constants. So what exactly are PHP constants? A constant is a name or identifier for a simple value. A constant value cannot change during the execution of the script. By default, a constant is case sensitive. By convention, constant identifiers are always in uppercase. A constant name starts with a letter or an underscore followed by any number of letters or numbers or underscore. If you have defined a constant, it can never be changed or undefined at a later stage. Let's take a look at an example of a constant. Now, to define a constant, you have to use the define function. Unlike with variables, you do not need to have a constant with a $ symbol. And here's an example of a constant in action. In line 2 and 3, we are actually defining the constant. So we call the define function. We then pass in the first parameter. And the parameter here is the uppercase word, which is my constant, and min size respectively. And then we assign the value to these constants. In the first case, we have a value of I am a constant. And in the second case, we have a value of 50. We then echo out the values of these constants and we can see them being printed out. Now, here is another example of a constant in action. The difference here is that we are trying to violate the very first rule of constant. And that is to say that you cannot update a constant at a later stage. In this block of code over here, we have two constants with the name of min size with different values, 50 and 100. So this eventually throws an error when we try to output it because we cannot create a constant with the same name or update a constant. That is the most important rule when it comes to constants, is that the values will always remain the same. And now it's time for that part of the lesson that everyone has been looking forward to. So without further ado, let's dive in and let's code. Now for today's tutorial, we are going to be working with the various data types that we just learned about. But for the most part, I want to keep the few first of them very basic. And as we progress, I really want to focus on working with arrays because I think arrays are quite complex for some people, but they are really, really powerful. So first things first, we want to ensure that we have our XAMPP server started up and we want to make sure our Apache and SQL server is running. Once you've completed this step, we can go ahead and we can start programming. So I'm going to create a new file over here. I will just save this file and I will call this PHP. So head over to my htdocs and I'll call this l4.php. Great. So now I can generate my boilerplate code for my HTML. And over here, I'm just going to call this PHP data types. And then maybe we can add a heading over here of h1 and we can call this PHP data types. Wonderful. So the next thing I'm going to go and do is I'm going to start writing my PHP code. So after my heading tag over here, I'm going to create a PHP tag for opening and closing. And then I'll start scripting my PHP. So save this. And I'm going to start with something very, very basic that we might have seen already. I'm just going to create a variable called x. And this variable is going to equal a string of hello world. And we maybe want to echo this out. So we can say echo. Or instead of echo, we can just call the var dump. We also want to make sure we close this off. So I'm going to go var underscore dump, and I need to pass in x as my variable. Let's close this off once again and let's save this up and see what we get. So after opening my browser, I'm just going to go localhost and let's just scroll to this one, change this to L4. And there we go. We can see we've got a string of 11 characters, including the space, of course, and this is hello world. So the var dump just allows us to check the data type that we are working with, okay? The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start working with just integers. So I'll create another variable over here called y, and this is going to be equal to 15. Pretty simple. And I'm going to do the var dump on this one as well. So var dump. Open my parentheses, close this off, and just pass in y. Save this up. And if I refresh, I have an integer of 15. Now I can add a break over here, but to make this more clean, I'll just go ahead and delete this. So let's comment this out. So we've seen that y is an integer of 15. Excellent. So let's just refresh. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to work with floats. So I'll comment this out again because I am going to come back to using that. And I'm going to create a variable called float. And I'm going to give this a value of 15.5. And once again, var underscore dump, open my parentheses, and pass in float. Let's just get this correct. Float. Save this up, make sure the code looks fine. Great. And refresh. And now we can see we've got a float with a value of 15.5. Okay, so let's try something a little different. Let's actually uncomment the code we have here. And I'm going to create a simple var dump. You can create a variable for this if you'd like to, but I'm going to take a shortcut over here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this and I'm going to remove this because I don't necessarily need this. Okay. What I want to try is I want to try to add y and float together to see which data type I get at the end of this. And you pretty much guessed this, but let's try it anyway. So I'll say y plus float, give me the var dump of this. So let's make sure the code looks fine. Everything looks great. Save this. And if I refresh now, I get float as a result. Why? Because if you add an integer and a float together, the end result will be a float because there are decimal point numbers afterwards. Okay, so that's just a neat little trick to keep in mind. So now that we've completed all of this, let's move over to working with arrays. So I'm pretty much going to replicate the example we saw in the slide. So I'm going to create an array called cars over here. And I'm going to set this equal to array. Let's actually just remove this. And then add parentheses. And then I'm going to call cars. So what I've done was created an empty array. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll add. This is the manual way of doing things, by the way. So I'll say cars at 0 index is equal to Toyota. And I'm going to create a new line. What I can do is copy and paste this. And very, very importantly, you want to make sure you are altering the index here. Remember, with an array, your index starts at 0. This is very, very important. So at index 0, I'm going to have Toyota. At index 1, I'll have Volvo. And at index 3, I'll have Porsche. Great. So let's just close all of this off. And now I want to echo all of this out. So I'll say echo cars. So here I'm just accessing my array. And then at index 0, print whatever is in this index, print the value of this index. And then I'll also add a break tag so we can get each result on a new line. And then I can actually just copy and paste this again. Let's just space this out. And then I'm going to print the value of each index out. Like so. So let's make sure our code looks fine. So I've got my empty array over here. I've assigned values manually, and then I'm printing those values out. Wonderful. So if I get back to the bottom, refresh, I have every single value within each index being printed out. Now there is an easy way to make this array a little more readable, and we can simply just delete all of this if we wanted to. I'm just going to comment this out, and I'll show you how we can actually do all of this over here in one line. So I'll go to Toyota. You can actually just copy and paste these values. I'll say Toyota. And then my next value, I need to add a comma so that we know this is the next index of that array. Okay, so this is how we can actually do this automatically. And then the last one is going to be Porsche. Again, a comma to separate the index. And then I'll paste this over here. And if we save this up, everything should work fine. In fact, we should see no changes because we just used a shorthand way of building an array. So if I refresh this, my results are exactly the same. So I could also edit this over here, and I could make this something like BMW if I wanted to. And of course, we expect that index to change. So we will not have Volvo, instead we'll have BMW. So again, this is just a shorthand way of doing the exact same thing as opposed to reading all of this code. And I would argue that this is a lot more simpler. Now, let's do one more thing and let's work with an associative array, because these arrays do work slightly differently in that they don't use numerical index, but rather strings as an index, which is quite useful when you are working with a NoSQL database, for example, or when you're working with unstructured data. But again, PHP was not exactly designed for that. So I'm going to create an array called salaries. And I'm just going to make this an empty array for now. Close this off. And then salaries again. So instead of using a numeric index, I'm going to use a key here. And the key here is going to be Peter. The value associated with this key is $5,000. This is going to be a string because I've got a dollar sign over here. So $5,000. Okay. And then I'll just copy this and paste it several times and alter the values. So I'll say Ben, and Ben maybe earns $7,000. And then I'll grab this one over here, call this Joe, and maybe Joe earns $4,000. And then I can simply go and echo all of this out. So I'll say echo salaries for Peter. I'll explain in a moment exactly what's going on over here. And then maybe I'll just add a break for a new line. So open, close, break, close this off. And then I'll just copy and paste this once again. And there we go. And here we'll have Ben. And then lastly, we'll have Joe. So let's just review the code quickly. So what I've done was I've created an array, but instead of using index such as numbers or numerical index, we've used values, string values, to access the data associated with this index value over here. Okay. So if we wanted to access this one, we use the key Peter to get the value of 5,000. Likewise, we do the same with Ben to get the value of this one over here, which is 7,000, and the same with Joe. And then we are just echoing that out. So we are echoing salaries, and we're echoing whatever Peter's key is, then give me the value associated with that. So we can expect $5,000 to be printed out here, $7,000 to be printed out here, and $4,000 to be printed out here. Let's validate this by reviewing our code. And there we go. Now, in the next lesson, I'm going to show you how we can actually use this to build more complex code. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll also show you how we can do this automatically using a shorthand instead of using all of these values that we have over here. So I'll comment this out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply grab Peter over here, and I'll say the key Peter. We can use a fat arrow over here. This is what this is called. And this is associated with 5,000. Okay, so 5,000. We actually need to put this inside of a string. And then next, I'll do the same with Ben. So what I can say is I can grab this. My comma needs to be outside of my quotation marks. So I'll grab this. I'll paste this over here. I'll alter this to Ben. Ben was 7,000. And then I'll grab this again, copy, make sure my comma separates the next index, paste this, and this one was Joe, I believe. And Joe was $4,000. And this is how we can do this all in one line as opposed to having several lines. And again, I would argue that this is a lot more efficient. So let's just save this up, refresh our code, and voila, everything works just fine. And that is how we can work with the various data types in PHP. Again, in our next lesson, we're going to focus on conditional logic, such as if, else, and so on statements, as well as the operators. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.